Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating and honestly kind of terrifying intersection of history and mystery. We're going to explore how the overarching, heavy dread of the Cold War basically set the perfect stage for one of history's most chilling, unsolved puzzles. We'll start by looking at the intense global tensions that completely defined the second half of the 20th century. And then, well, we're going to journey straight into the freezing Ural Mountains. Because, as you'll see, that exact same atmosphere of extreme secrecy and paranoia might just hold the key to a tragedy that has literally baffled investigators for over 60 years.
To really wrap our heads around the mindset of this era, we have to recognize the constant, everyday existential dread that hovered over everyone. I mean, imagine waking up every single morning knowing that a world destroyed by nuclear fire was a very genuine possibility. For over 4 decades, humanity came far closer to this total nightmare than most people even realize today. The world was standing on the absolute edge of total destruction, driven by this silent, tense conflict, where the stakes, literally the survival of humanity, couldn't possibly be higher. Now, in 1945, after the ashes of World War II finally settled, the peace didn't last. The globe effectively fractured into 2 massive camps, each led by an emerging superpower. On one side, you had the United States, championing capitalism and democracy, and on the other, the Soviet Union, deeply rooted in communism and state control. Both powers firmly believed, without a doubt, that their system was the absolute right one to shape the future of humanity. Actually, it wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a total, fundamental clash of ideologies that literally split the globe right down the middle.
And look at how perfectly our mystery sits right in the thick of this historical timeline. 1945 marks the end of the Second World War. Fast forward a bit to 1957, and boom, the space race kicks off with the launch of Sputnik. By 1961, we're seeing the physical division of Europe with the construction of the Berlin Wall. But right there in the middle, in 1959, is the Dyatlov Pass Incident. So this happens at a time when technology is advancing at breakneck speed, government secrecy is at an all-time high, and the entire world is basically holding its breath. All right, Section 1, the Dyatlov Pass Mystery, February 1959, the frozen Ural Mountains. 9. That is the number of highly experienced hikers led by an instructor named Igor Dyatlov who ventured into the frozen Ural Mountains. Now, their mission was pretty straightforward: complete a challenging winter expedition. These were young, healthy, highly trained people prepared for these exact conditions, and they documented everything. They were laughing, taking photographs, keeping daily journals. Everything seemed entirely normal right up until they approached a specific mountain. Their final photographs showed really harsh weather and heavy growing snowfall, and then just absolute silence. Every single piece of communication stopped. And so this is the chilling question investigators were forced to ask when rescue teams finally discovered their campsite weeks later. When the hikers didn't return, a massive search was launched. They finally found the tent partially buried in the snow. But, it wasn't the snow that alarmed the rescuers. It was the absolute, inexplicable panic left behind in that camp. It's a panic that honestly continues to haunt researchers to this very day, because the evidence they found was just completely baffling. First off, the tent had been violently slashed open, but not from the outside. It was cut from the inside. Whatever terrified them was so immediate, so horrifying, that they didn't even take the time to untie the door. Footprints showed they fled in a blind panic out into the minus 30 degrees Celsius wilderness. And even more bizarre, they were found barefoot or wearing only super thin layers of clothing, totally unequipped for that deadly cold. When the bodies were finally recovered, some near a forest edge, others not found for months under deep snow, the scene made zero sense. Several of the victims had suffered these severe, completely unexplained internal injuries. So over the decades, investigators have thrown out countless explanations trying to make sense of this. Sure, natural disasters like an avalanche or crazy powerful winds could maybe explain some of the panic. But the severe internal injuries, the missing clothes, that led to much wilder theories. And honestly, when you look at the ideas of secret military tests or experimental weapons, well, they might sound like straight-up science fiction today, but they suddenly make a terrifying amount of sense when you remember the deeply, deeply paranoid era these young hikers were living in. Moving on to Section 2, Missiles and the Space Race, the escalation of Cold War paranoia. To really understand why ordinary people so easily believed the Soviet military might be testing bizarre experimental weapons out near Dyatlov Pass, we just have to look at what global governments were actually doing a few years later. In October 1962, the entire world literally held its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis. American President John F. Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev were locked in a standoff that brought modern civilization straight to the brink. One single wrong move, or even a miscommunication, could have triggered the end of humanity. 90 miles. American spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles away from the coast of Florida. I mean, think about that proximity for a second. You could practically drive that distance on a highway in an hour and a half. It proved to the entire world that the threat of experimental, devastating, world-ending weapons wasn't just some paranoid fantasy. It was a terrifying, concrete reality sitting right on their literal doorstep. And this massive conflict wasn't just being fought with weapons pointed across oceans, it was being fought up in the stars. Take a look at this back and forth. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked absolutely everyone by launching Sputnik. America immediately responded with massive, unprecedented investments in science and tech. This intense rivalry drove incredibly rapid technological leaps, and all of it was engineered entirely behind closed doors. That exact kind of absolute government-mandated secrecy is exactly why hidden weapons testing in the Urals seems so entirely plausible to people. But this intense government control wasn't just hidden away in remote test sites. It manifested right in the middle of city streets. In 1961, the Berlin Wall rose practically overnight. Concrete, barbed wire, and armed guards separated families instantly. No warning. For nearly 3 decades, this physical wall stood as the ultimate, heartbreaking symbol of a world that was rigidly divided by extreme ideology and state control. Which brings us to Section 3, the fall and lingering questions, the end of an era. It's crazy, but the rapid sequence of events that finally unraveled all this tension changed history forever, without a direct battle ever actually being fought between the superpowers. By the late 1980s, the Soviet economy was heavily struggling. And then the emotional climax. In 1989, the Berlin Wall finally fell. Millions of people celebrated in the streets as East and West were reunited. Just 2 short years after that, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed entirely. The Cold War, this silent, brooding conflict that defined entire generations, was officially over. Yet the impact of that paranoid era totally still shapes our reality today, doesn't it? Nuclear weapons are still here, and global tensions certainly haven't disappeared. Which leaves us with a really provocative thought to end on. Looking at the big picture and the small details, the lessons of the Cold War are as relevant today as ever. Do you think our modern world could survive another standoff of that magnitude? And zooming back in on a local scale, as we reflect on the intense secrecy of that time, what do you actually think terrified those 9 young hikers enough to make them slice open their tent and run barefoot into the freezing darkness? The mountains know the truth, but they aren't telling. I'd absolutely love to hear your theories in the comments. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history around us.